Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about the center cut. Partially, why do we do it, right? So this cut is very, very common in Japanese and Korean sword styles, right? Obviously not as common in a lot of European sword styles for kind of an obvious reason. So it's not that a center cut isn't useful to anyone, wearing armor or anyone like in the HEMA practicing world. It's simply that you have a cross guard, right? So just the equipment that you're using, right? So a guard with a traditional Japanese sword is relative to, again, like a HEMA cross guard or even, a more traditionally made cross guard, that's still going to be much wider, right? So with this, it actually gives me so much locomotion, right, that I actually really don't have any hindrance to it, as opposed to if I had a cross guard here, again, because the blade is oriented this way, the cross guard would be going this way. It's a little bit more precarious because I might get myself before I get the opponent if I have the cross guard. So anyway, that's a very, very brief reason why a lot of European swords don't do as many center cuts, which you can still do, it's just not as common. But first, let me dissuade you of using center cuts, right? So why would you not use a center cut? Because initially, it seems kind of obvious, right? Because okay, I have a sword, I bring it overhead, I come down, that sounds really good, really easy, cool. In a fight, right? So if we're fighting, and I'm using like our classic, middle guard here, which again, I have opinions on, but let's assume both of us are kind of coming from either like a kendo or a kendo adjacent background, right? So where this guard is like the standard. Okay, if I'm fighting this way and you see me do this, what am I doing? Like most likely I'm doing some sort of center or left-right cut, right? So it's very, very obvious what you're doing from the get-go, right? So if I'm fighting you and I'm like, you're gonna be like, I'm gonna not get hit by that, right? And these center cuts also like one of the easiest things to defend yourself from. You see a center cut, that's enough, right? Because a center cut isn't the most powerful cut that we have. That usually goes to like some form of a diagonal, just because you can use your hip a lot more, you can use your shoulder a lot more, you can use gravity a lot more. All of that is going to give you a lot more of a powerful strike, as opposed to the center cut. Now, saying the center cut is not a weak cut, but it's not our strongest. So even if someone came fully dedicated to that cut, so long as I'm, again, squeezing on impact with a block, I'm probably okay, right? And added bonus to me, the defender, if we're using live blades like they obviously did back in the day, if I catch your sword on mine, you're stuck there, right? So sharp swords against each other are very sticky, right? They don't like magically slide off the way, like, for example, a dull sword versus a dull sword would do. So you can imagine if I'm striking with a center cut and I get stuck here, I'm not great, right? So again, if I'm stuck here, I can't even like drop down to defend myself because I'm stuck. I can like pivot along, let's just say I made contact here. I can pivot along like that axis, right? But I am very, very open in so many ways, right? So from here, obviously a lot of my guts, right, or the dole, if we're talking about like kendo strikes, for example, very open, right? If I really need to defend myself from like, if they like just cock it back and give me a giant diagonal, I can disengage, but like just by putting my sword out there, it's not gonna be that powerful. So the center cut kind of puts you in a position that if it doesn't land, you're kind of not doing well. So keep that in mind before we talk about maybe what it's for. Now, are there other versions of the center cut that are more likely to land? Of course, right? So again, I'm taking something specifically from kendo. So there's a version of, again, this is called the men strike. Again, men just meaning face, right? Or it's the helmet that we're striking, right? So if we do a full strike this way, obviously all the things I just talked about are still applicable. I just like, so the way that I learned it was just literally called small men, right? So a small men strike is, so the idea of it is like almost like you're going to stab above their head and then boop, right? So you come in, boop, and then you just kind of keep going. So that is a lot more likely to land, right? Because like if we're in guard and you're just sliding toward me and then just boop me on the head, you're a lot more likely to land it, right? However, right? So just because this is the portion of me dissuading you. So first of all, if I feel you coming towards me with a thrust and you haven't disengaged in any way, I'm gonna deflect you, right? So like the moment someone is pushing towards me this way, I'm gonna naturally want to suppress you in some way. So what I would personally recommend is this suppression. You actually turn the blade and slap down. Just because if they're using a curved blade, your slapping motion is actually going to force them down a lot more because you're, again, slashing down along with their curve. So if you were doing a small man against me and we're both using, again, the curved sword, I can slap you away pretty easily. And then now, so now look from the side, if I'm here and your sword's on top of mine, all of the stuff that I was aiming for initially is open. So this motion, if it doesn't land, once again, is going to be deflected, and I am in a worse position than if I did a full strike, because now my head is exposed, as well as, again, my shoulders. If they really want to go for the heart or go underneath the armpit or something like that, which would be a little bit harder, they could. So granted, if you do land it, in an actual like sword fight, doing that guy will give you some damage, but probably not as much as you would want considering the risk that you're taking. Now, can we actually take that and use it to our advantage? Absolutely, right? So because the center cut is like the easiest thing to block, I'm trying to think of a counterexample to that statement, but if someone's coming in with a center cut, my first instinct and the easiest instinct is just to get my sword in the way, and that's usually enough. But again, if you're used to using a center cut, you can use that as a baiting motion, right? So one thing that, again, I'm using kendo a lot in this video for some reason. So what they do is like, so this is our prep, both for our center cut and our sayomen. So again, our left-right strikes as well. So by giving me that big preparation, they can block how they're going to. I can last minute turn course and strike wherever is open. So that is something that's nice about the center cut, is knowing that the other person knows how to block it. I can bait them to do something that I want them to do and strike them some other way. So, yay. So I just talked about why it's not great. Let's talk about why we do it. So one reason is not as exciting. Simply, it is probably the best cut to start cutting with, mostly from a body mechanics standpoint. So when we learn how to do this center cut, so this is a prototype that I learned. I don't recommend actually cutting with this, but it's a nice way to learn how to cut, so long as you don't have like a sharp pointy sword, which this is. So the idea of that is literally just tip to tailbone, or close to, don't actually do it because that might hurt. Because that's going to teach you to have equal and opposite motion on this side. So when I strike, I'm not doing something weird like this, where my left hand's doing all the work, my right hand's just kind of like flying by at the end. With a completely upright cut like this, it's equal and opposite. It teaches you to have that straight angle. It teaches you to really learn how to use your core and your lower back and your glute, all of that, to really give yourself a good cut forward, and again, learning hard gear and stuff like that. And because it is also a very straightforward thing to block, and because it's also one of the most likely things for someone to strike with, it is also an excellent way to learn how to block, right? So especially if someone's brand new to swordsmanship and they see someone doing this towards them, their first instinct is actually usually, so long as it's not running away, pretty good, right? So they come in, they're like, or even just like, this way. Even this is better than, just embracing the cold embrace of death, right? So this is an excellent way to teach how to use a sword, right? Because it teaches you to get used to the body mechanics, again, using the right muscle groups and seeing and hitting a target. So in that way, it's an excellent cut. The analogy I usually give is the center cut is the equivalent of our number 2 punch. I don't know why I keep giving things numbers, right? So if we're kind of like fighting someone here, jab is kind of like a number 1. Number 2 is the one we're actually able to shift and throw all of your body weight into a punch. So what do I mean by that? Because I just said that the center cut isn't our most powerful cut. What do I mean, right? So it's the situation of, if I can land this number 2, I'm pretty good, right? If I can set up the situation such that like, oh wait, I have a clear shot to like the temple or wherever I want to be aiming, if I can get that opening and throw my weight into a full-blown punch, that person's going down, right? Same thing with our center cut. If that center cut can land, it's hitting like the prime source, right? So if I can hit the noggin, right, the brain, and really do some damage to that, that's the end of a sword fight, right? So as opposed to something that's a lot more likely to happen, like especially if you're not wearing armor, of like gut shots at some point, you might die from it, right? It would just take a longer time and also be more painful and all that fun stuff. So like that fight could go on for a very long time as opposed to just and you're kind of done, right? So that's what is so great about the center cut, is that like if you can land it, you do quite well. But how do you land a center cut, right? So that's kind of like the big business with sports like kendo and HEMA to even to a certain degree. It's like, how do you land that singular cut that if you know it lands, you're good, right? Whether that means getting a point, whether that means winning a match, whether that means knocking someone out. How do we do it? I'm going to make all the math people happy. Geometry, right? And this is the word that I learned from Bryn Miller, who was my instructor for HEMA, when she was talking about. So it's all about like how you're facing your opponent. Now, part of that's going to be center line, right? So again, if we're open hands this way, this is not how you should actually box this way, but if we're here and both of us are on the center line, I just punch center line, or whoever is in front of me, their hands are going to be in the way, right? So if I punch this way, they're just going to be like, no, stop, right? Versus if I'm here and you're there, and I just kind of shift over enough, right? I can do that. So part of it is just going to be a geometry problem, right? So I hope that there is eventually a sword geometry teacher like working through problems, like if you move on like a pi/6 angle and you do X, Y, and Z, what's going to happen? That'll be a lot of fun. But anyway, so it's all about geometry, which is why there is a move, I believe it's in one of the Fiore manuals. I'm going to butcher it because I haven't done that in a very long time, but something very similar to this, right? Where the idea is you're actually just moving offline, right? So I'm going to do a simpler version, right? So if someone were to strike me, let's just say like with a diagonal or something like that, and I cover this way, and if I just am able to pivot enough to strike down, now granted that's a left cut and it's supposed to be a direct center, but again, they're using cross guards. If I can strike that way and I can hit their head, awesome, right? So the main thing with a center cut, if you're going to be using it not for teaching purposes, and you're not going to be doing it from a sport perspective, is going to be geometry, right? How do I move around such that I can actually land that? That is unfortunately going to be based on your style. Most likely, that's going to mean moving on angles, right? So the classic example is, again, moving off here and doing some sort of like center cut or something like that. Or if you don't want to move too much offline, it's going to be how do you get rid of the opponent's sword that's in the way, right? So sometimes, so what Gumdo does, for example, is you just hit it out of the way, which if you're fighting someone who knows how to fight and my sword just knocked out of the way, there's something I can do so that I don't lose track of the sword. But as long as you know what you're doing and you strike in such a way that you know how to kind of like work with how they're likely to move, however you move, is going to be good. So keep that in mind. So if you want to land a center cut, the most likely way to do so is both disengaging or moving their sword offline and getting yourself offline so that you have a clear shot to where you want to be. The last thing I want to leave you with, right, is going to be a general idea with sword, right? So whenever you're striking a partner, you want to make sure you have a way to get out. So what that can mean, so for example, if we're doing like a diagonal cut here, that might be thrust back guard, so you have some sort of prep and protection before you move off in the other direction. So as you practice doing center cuts with someone, make sure you're also priming that. The main reason I want to primarily focus on that with this video is if you didn't land that center cut, as we talked about earlier, you're kind of not great is the short version of it, versus if I do a center cut and I'm like, oh, nope, you blocked it. Make sure, go on an angle, cover, even if it's just a step back with some sort of guard, right? So I highly encourage you, whenever you're practicing with a center cut, think about how you're getting out of there with some sort of cover. But keep in mind, there are a lot of different variants of any of these cuts. So, you know, play with whatever you've learned, play with things maybe you've seen somewhere, and just see if the same, you know, concepts we play with today apply to those as well. So with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.